Originally from Pakistan, Babar is an urban planner and development economist specializing in urban management and housing finance. He studied architecture and planning in Turkey and then Ghana, and later on at the Architectural Association in London. He joined the DPU in 1974 and was full-time member of the academic staff for over 30 years, and its director from 2003 to 2005.
Babar, you joined the DPU in 1974, right? What were your interests at the time?
The areas that I was immediately and increasingly drawn towards was housing, and within housing, the notion of affordable housing, and to housing policy in the sense of making an impact or a change to housing at a large scale through policy.
So what were your concerns when you first started teaching?
Well, I think, as I said, they were the ones that I was most struck with, which was the need to have a relevant training that one could actually apply, and one that would make a difference to the lives of people. At that time, the DPU was getting something like 90% or 95% of students from overseas, and probably 90% of those from developing countries. So it was Latin America, Asia, and Africa, and that made me feel even more so that we must be able to react and feed into those realities. Those were the driving forces that I think sort of stayed with me and still do, of trying to combine or this make sure that there was a seamless transfer between theory and practice by inserting a kind of feedback loop, which I think again we pioneered, and with my work, particularly with the extension service and so on, I made a very conscious effort to get all of our staff to go abroad and work in the field and bring that experience back into the teaching.
Babar, I know you played an important role in the extension service, which included institutional capacity building and also professional training. So could you tell us a bit more about it and how it came about, and what were your objectives?
The original extension service, it came out of our frustrations as students and as young practitioners. So we wanted to develop a better course for housing. But at the same time, we felt that one of the problems was the lack of teaching in developing countries, that there were not enough people who understood the subject, and that if we were going to make an impact, we should actually address the teachers as well. So the original intention was to take a course on housing to a particular place for 8-10 weeks and to run that course, but in parallel to work with the local staff and talk to them about pedagogics and different changes and so on and so on. We tried to take this further with a lot of the things that we learned from this, with the main change that we were then no longer taking a predetermined course. So we moved this into a situation where we said, look, when we do consultancies, then capacity building should be the purpose of it, not the project design. That should be incidental, or it comes out. And that was, a lot of that was led by the thinking and the experience we got through the extension service.
Going back to housing, what were the debates at the time, and how did these change?
Probably the leading light force at that time was John Turner and his work. And John set up the initial housing course at the DPU. I was, and a lot of other people were, very heavily influenced by both what John was doing, but more importantly the whole field that he had opened up, particularly for people like myself who came from a physical, spatial background, to be able to take on board other aspects. The big challenge really is how to get beyond the notion that housing is not just the bricks and mortar, that it's what it does to people, it's how people build it, and that financing and affordability is perhaps more important than styles and what it looks like and so on. So in a sense, that was one of the main challenges in housing. Equally, what is quite interesting is that even though from perhaps quite some time the notion of affordability has been seen as quite an important one, housing finance has not. I mean, it's difficult to kind of explain that, because you'd think that anybody who was doing housing must be aware and deal with housing finance. But in a sense, because there was such a split between the architects who did the housing design and the economists that worked on or the financial sector, that the two just couldn't talk. And in that sense, I feel very privileged that I actually made that thing and, sort of graduated as an architect, worked as an architect, then came back and did economics. And so I was able to bring a lot of those things together and demonstrate. And I think that those were the challenges, was to kind of bring about institutional change in the way that housing and housing policy were perceived, to shift housing away from something that the government builds, to incorporate ideas about affordability and finance into housing. I think those were the three big challenges, and I wouldn't say by any means that we've overcome them, or that even that all architects or all housing ministries take a different view on it. But at least I think nowadays the things that people talk about and how they tackle them have been influenced or have been changed as a result of the work that we were doing, that our colleagues at the World Bank, at MIT, so we ran joint workshops between DPU and MIT on issues of housing policy and housing affordability and so on. And that influenced a number of people and governments and so on. So I think that was probably the main issue. I think the one that still remains, and it's only now being taken up with any real kind of impact, is housing finance. I spent a long time trying to make the change between what housing finance means to people and conventional housing finance, and trying to show that conventional finance was largely supply driven, that it did not look at demand. It assumed that you had to change people's behavior to be able to access the finance that was being supplied. Now again, non-conventional housing finance is beginning to be seen as norm, and ironically the work I've been doing recently, which has been in Middle East, where people have suddenly started to assert their Muslim identity. Whether it's true or not doesn't matter, but they suddenly started to say that interest is haram, that we won't pay any interest. And so suddenly you're confronted with saying, well, how do you do housing finance if you don't believe in paying interest? And whereas the conventional response to this by the banks and so on has been to stop using the word interest and call it administrative charge. It is effectively interest. And it didn't take very long for people in the Muslim world to realize that that's all it was, that this was a face-saving device, but that it didn't overcome their real objections. So the work we've been doing now, which has been to try and evolve genuine responses to this in ways that have also thrown up, I think, more effective ways of looking at finance and accessibility to housing and affordability. So I think that's the area that I think is now the one that needs exploring and expanding more in housing.
How might this finance be organized?
Well, what we're saying is that this is the kind of thing that the government could take a greater interest in by providing the regulations behind financing. Because I mean, if you take a typical country, something like 10, maybe maximum 20% of the people who build houses use formal housing finance. The rest make do with a whole variety of things. This is an area which requires a different kind of risk, and government is the only organization that is in a position to take that risk and demonstrate that the real risk is very low, because most people want to have their house. I mean, people do not willingly not keep up their payments and so on. But also to recognize 2 or 3 other aspects about housing. That not everybody needs to own a house. What you need is secure tenure. And again, the conventional response to that is social housing. And we are saying no, there are other ways in which you can provide the security of tenure because social housing has its own implications and connotations and so on. When we've talked to governments, they've always said, oh, if you want government intervention, then you must aim for the lowest. And we say, but the lowest don't need housing, or they do need housing, but that's a very different kind of housing, and we'll talk about that. But it must be separated from the normal provision of housing, because if somebody is at that bottom 10%, it's unfair to even take 1% of that income away from them and give it to housing, and it's usually much more than that, because you're then saying, well, it should be one that leads to ownership. So it's getting the government to change or to recognize the realities of how people move economically during their working lives and so on, and be a bit more flexible, so that you do need then, I think we need the reintroduction in some ways of a whole rental sector. And again, that's something that I think that the government and the community sectors could and should get into more. It's opening up housing to some of the different nuances, rather than just taking a simplistic one policy fits all.
Finally, Baba, what would you say were the highlights of your career?
The most joy I've had is last week I had somebody here who we worked with in India 20 years ago or something. He was at that time the municipal commissioner, and came to London, and he's now the one of the election commissioners in India. So he was here for some meetings, and he came and saw me, and he said, you people, when you came to Hyderabad and you worked in the slums and you wanted to do us, I thought you were mad, and if it hadn't been for British aid, we wouldn't have done any of those things that you said. But now, if you go to these places, I have to remind people that this was a slum. So that kind of feedback, I think, is what's been the most pleasurable. Similarly, I went back to Sri Lanka after the tsunami. Took a trip to one of the places we've been working in before, 20 years ago, on some housing scheme. And I'm walking down there, and suddenly I sort of started to notice a kind of some kind of like buzzing, and people coming closer and saying things. And I thought, oh my God, they're going to lynch me if somebody's done something. And then I looked around, and there were these women who were all sort of pointing. I said, what's happening? And we had to translate it, and they said, they're saying, you are the guy who changed their lives. So we want to thank you. I mean, for that, I'd give a year's sort of wasted time, and because you can say that.
Goodness. That's really touching, actually.
Yeah. Again, I mean, if I think of what is one of my most cherished memories in that sense, again, it's a small thing perhaps, but to me, I was very impressed. In Nepal, I was teaching on a training course with Michael Mattingly, and Michael was introducing me to that audience because he'd just run the course before, and he said, this is Babar Mumtaz, and he's the one who taught me that learning can be fun, and that is if something I'd like to be remembered for, is that to show people that you can learn without it being a drudgery, or because you got to get a piece of paper, but because you enjoy it, and that it's up to us as teachers or as an institution to create those kind of conditions that people learn because they enjoy learning.
Yeah.